Welcome back to Elpida, a podcast that spreads hope and awareness about incarceration. I'm your host, Ariadne Brempu, and today's episode will cover a psychologist's explanation of the causes and effects of incarceration. It will feature James Dunlea, a Columbia PhD professor and researcher. He spent most of his years studying the impact of incarceration in a multitude of ways. Today, he will use this knowledge to describe the factors that lead to incarceration and why they do. Specifically, he will dive into the roles of parents, education, neighborhood, poverty, racism, and sexism in incarceration. He will also explain the psychological impact that exists when a person is actually behind bars. So grab your headphones, settle in, and let's get into it. Why are most people incarcerated while in their youth?
Well, that's a big question as to why people are incarcerated first of all, and particularly there's the layer of youth on top of it, right? So let's start with the question like why people are incarcerated, and then we can kind of transition to your more specific question. Incarceration is multi-causal, which basically means that there are a lot of different reasons for why somebody might be incarcerated. Um, when people think about incarceration, I think they oftentimes get it wrong in terms of, what is the big picture that's driving incarceration. And, decades of research in sociology, anthropology and related fields have really focused on, the role of the social environment in driving incarceration. And so when I say social environment, I mean things like um, socioeconomic status and systemic racism and systemic violence, as ultimately, kind of being the causal root of incarceration. But people don't oftentimes think about that. And so, we can talk more about that, later on maybe. But a lot of this relates back to kind of societal forces, right, that are powerfully shaping economic opportunity and educational opportunity. And for many people who are incarcerated, it's a lack of those, resources. Um, so, big picture is there's a lot of societal forces shaping, incarceration, but specifically in youth, right? So why is youth a particularly interesting time to be looking at, pathways to incarceration? Again, uh, it's not an easy answer, really. There's a lot of different things going on. So um, you can think about risk taking during childhood and adolescence. We know from, decades of research within psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, that your brain doesn't fully develop until you're about 25 years old, right? It doesn't reach peak maturity until then. And so, you know, kids who are, in their early teens and even later teens, they think that they are mature and adult, but in reality, their decision-making processes are very risk prone. Um, and so, that prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to really kind of, put the brakes on risky decisions, it's not really working, I guess, at that point, as much as maybe a neurotypical adult, right? And so people are making riskier decisions in their youth. Those risky decisions can be to break the law. It can be to, potentially harm other people or act impulsively in other ways, right? And so sometimes, again, those ways can be dangerous to themselves or others. And, that can land people in kind of hot water with the law, right? Um, but I think also a story that, we need to think about a little bit more with youth incarceration is, well, why are people, affiliating, sometimes in groups that we deem to be dangerous or bad? So for example, gangs, right? A lot of youth incarceration is tied back to gang activity, particularly in, metropolitan areas. Um, and so I think it's a really easy thing for people to say, oh, kids join gangs because they're bad kids or they have lack of supervision. Um, a lot of it relates back to social connection, right? During this time period, people are really, really craving, you know, connection with their peers, and to be connected, in times of isolation. Um, and so is it so crazy that somebody is joining a gang? If you think about it in terms of just a social affiliation reason, not really. However, when there are instances where people, will join a gang, that can lead to negative outcomes, right? But the causal reason underneath it is more of a social affiliation sort of thing. And so then you can think, well, okay, if there's a need for social affiliation, then, does that mean that prior it was lacking? Potentially, right? There could be a lack of other, healthy opportunities for social engagements and other avenues, right? And so the big picture story that we can think about then is, well, how do we then encourage students, other young people to be picking those healthier options if they're available? And then if they're not available, how do we make them available?
That being said, a lot of the time perception doesn't align with reality. Do you think that most people have an accurate view on why incarceration happens?
I don't actually think that. And it's something that I have personally done a lot of research on. So, um, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of work in the social sciences that has found that incarceration is both a symptom and a driver of inequality. And so, this is really suggesting that there are, forces such as, poverty and lack of education and systemic violence, that if you, trace that, back is kind of a root cause of this incarceration problem. Um, However, our brains are not really set up as humans to think about structural causes, really. So, there's this thing called the fundamental attribution error within psychology. And the fundamental attribution error makes our brains think about problems on an individual level. So if I was to, let's just say, see somebody, being late for work. So let's just say Ariadne is late for work. It's really easy for somebody to say, "Ah, you know what? I think she's probably a lazy person or she has bad time management. It's something about her that is making her late for work, right? Our brain automatically goes there. However, in reality, there could be a lot of reasons why somebody is late for work. Maybe their car broke down. Maybe there's a lot of traffic that day. Maybe, there was a lack of childcare and the person had to figure out last minute plans for, where to, have their kid go during the daytime while they're at work. There's a lot of other explanations, but our brain doesn't automatically go there. We automatically think about the person. And so this really relates back to how we think about a lot of social phenomena in the world, including incarceration. So when we ask people, hey, why does incarceration happen? They generate typically two different types of answers. One type of answer is, well, they did something bad. They focus on that person's individual behavior. So maybe that person broke the law, maybe that person did something bad, they stole something, etc. That's one category of responses that people typically talk about reasons for incarceration. The second category um, is really related to that person's moral character. And so some people say things like, this person is a bad person, and that's why they're incarcerated. And I think both are cognitively simple explanations because you're ignoring the fact that other things might be going around that person that are making them act in certain ways. Um, but I think this perception is a dangerous one as well. Um, when you pin, incarceration on a cause like somebody's bad moral character, who they are on the inside, what does that do for how we think about incarcerated people? Um, it makes our brains not think very kindly, right? It makes us view incarceration as something that is um, a symptom of moral depravity, of moral difference between people who are incarcerated and who are not incarcerated. And so it kind of sets up this like us versus them mentality. And that's a really dangerous thing to do. And so, of course, the thing we should be thinking about is, how do we correct these views about incarceration.
Now, from these actual causes of incarceration, why do
Mhm.
parents play such a big role?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, parents play a huge role in their kids' lives, right? Just at baseline. Early on, um, parents teach children through their explicit, behaviors, and their testimony to kids, so what they say. Um, but even beyond that, kids, like I said, are kind of picking up on, parents, nonverbal actions as well. Um, a lot of times when you think about, families where, there is incarceration presence, um, it is something that is not an individual instance. It is intergenerational, right? Um, and so when you think about, parents who might be gone from a household, typically it's the father, most and people who are incarcerated are men, and so that could translate to, fathers being gone out of the house. What does that do to the environment the child is growing up in, right? Children who grow up in environments with one parent can certainly have very loving households, but might have fewer economic resources compared to children who grow up in different homes, right, with the two parents' income. Again, this relates back to the whole societal conversation. When you have fewer resources, what do? Right? People have to make money somehow. And in, environments where there is one income, sometimes kids are expected to contribute to income in the households. When kids get old enough, they, are kind of sent out earlier on and, sent to look for where money can come from. And again, sometimes where situations are, a little bit tricky, um, money has to come from places where, the law says that it might not, shouldn't come from, right? So that might be, drugs or other avenues where, money can be coming in. Again, you know, we're oftentimes making moral judgments around whether that action is good or bad. But in reality, it's really tied back to a more economic type, reason for people engaging in certain behaviors. And so certainly, parental situations, right, maybe with somebody who is incarcerated versus not, are shaping the stability of kids' environments.
In terms of parental violence, how does that play an impact on youth?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, like I, have talked about a little bit earlier, kids are like sponges, right? They're soaking up things that are in their environment, and the home is a microcosm for a kid. They view it as kind of maybe reflective of how the larger world is. And so, if there is a behavior that is normalized at home, um, kids might say, maybe that's a normal thing, and they might perpetrate that behavior outside the home. It could be, watching domestic violence between parents themselves, but children themselves can be, victims of violence as well. And of course, that is something that is really something that could affect the brain in complex ways, right? So, in victims of violence, the brain's stress response essentially becomes hyperactivated. So the amygdala, which is the part of your brain that processes fear and threat detection, it can become enlarged and overactive when people are always in that kind of environment, that violent environment, which ultimately leads to heightened anxiety and hypervigilance because you're always thinking, well, when is it going to erupt? When is my environment going to be unstable? And so you become hypervigilant to threats in the environment. The amygdala is not the only thing, though, that is affected. So the hippocampus, which is critical for memory formation, this oftentimes shrinks due to chronic stress hormone exposure, which is what violence is. And this can impair the ability to form new memories or properly contextualize traumatic ones. the prefrontal cortex, which is again responsible for executive function like decision making and emotional regulation, that shows decreased connectivity and activity in violent situations that are kind of chronic. And so this makes it harder for people to think clearly and plan ahead and to manage their intense emotions. And so these changes help explain why trauma survivors or victims of repeated violence or people who are just privy to seeing repeated violence, um, that explains why they experience things like flashbacks or difficulty concentrating, emotion dysregulation. Um, and so all of these things matter, in terms of violence within the home because they could really be powerfully shaping how a child is acting and behaving and what they think is normalized in the first place. It's shaping people's behaviors, but it can actually be also shaping people's neurobiology.
Another way that youth are exposed to violence is through violent media. Can you explain the impact of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just another information source, right, for kids to be plugging into and to be thinking about what is normalized within culture. And so media is just another route that they can, see that, something isn't so bad, right? So if you think about, TV or just other, avenues of pop culture like, music or just, video games, there are certain types of violence that are particularly prevalent. And so one of those is shooting, right? There's a lot of shooting games out there, um, violence, particularly violence toward women. And so again, those are just other data points for a child to see to say, hey, what I'm seeing out in the world, that's a normal thing. So maybe if I act that way, it's not going to be that bad. Um, it can also glorify those sorts of, it can glorify those sorts of behaviors in, of course, ways that we don't want to be glorified. But again, when kids are plugging into this media, and if it's, especially if it's used by their friends as well, you know, that in-group thinking is so powerful, that normative thinking is so powerful for kids that they'll continue to use that even if, maybe they don't think it's that good initially, that group think can make it seem less bad and they might, kind of view it as more normalized them.
Why is the way children are punished for those behaviors so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. So, there's different types of punishments, for kids. And so there can be things like logical consequences. Logical consequences is basically when um, you you inform the punishment by making a child kind of like restore what they have uh, perpetrated. So, like an example would be like if a kid has a temper tantrum and they take a remote control and they break their remote control, logical consequences would mean that the kid has to figure out how to put together the remote control that they just broke. So they caused a harm and they have to repair the harm that they have perpetrated. That is a relatively healthy way to showcase, look, there are consequences for your actions, and I need you to repair the harm that you have caused, right? Um, Other sorts of punishment, however, can be physical in nature, right? So spanking or hitting a child. Corporal punishment has been shown over and over and over again to be bad. Corporal punishment is not good for kids. It again relates back to the conversation about violence and the type of behaviors that can be normalized for kids. And so part of the reason why it's bad is because it's showing kids, well, this is how you respond when somebody upsets you is through violence, which is, of course, not the right answer. But then when we talked about kind of that increased stress response of, this actually changing the brain connectivity and how certain parts of your brains are functioning, if a kid is repeatedly, hit and spanked and, there's corporal punishment that is employed, um, it can lead to these, more drastic changes in how their brain is developing. But again, I think that, there's newer movements that suggests that punishment is wrong overall. There's no form of punishment that's appropriate. Um, and if you don't respond to a child's wrongdoing in any way, then you can send the wrong message there as well of that behavior being permissible. Do we want a kid to throw a tantrum and break something around them? Of course not. Do we want them to have a tantrum and hit somebody? Of course not. So there has to be some sort of response that the child is coached to have, right? And so whether that is through logical consequences of, having them repair harm that they have perpetrated, or, the role of apologies in harm, teaching a kid to apologize for what they have done wrong is important. So I think the message here isn't that there is no consequence for actions. That's not the case. But it's that we have to teach, parents to respond in appropriate ways.
Aside from parenting, there are other things that can impact a child's trajectory. What role does education play in preventing incarceration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, education is so important. Obviously, I'm biased because I have gone to school for 1,000 years. But education opens doors. In the United States, education is viewed as a key to social mobility and to growth in terms of your career and social status, right? And so education is extremely important in that regard. Um, because education is so tied to income within the United States, it's something that um, I think is inseparable from the conversation around incarceration. So oftentimes people who become incarcerated on average, have lower income levels, on average have lower education levels. And so, even when they leave carceral facilities, right, jail or prison, um, they are locked out of educational opportunities. What that does is essentially lock them out of, economic opportunities as well. One thing to think about as well, just on top of this, is of course we can say, education is important, it can lead to social mobility. I think we also have to think about the mindsets of inculcating within people who are incarcerated of this student mindset. There are many people who are incarcerated who have been taught that education is not for you. It is not a place where you belong. And so, introducing this idea of you can be a student, you can have this growth mindset of this future orientation of you can choose who you want to be, you can choose the pathway that you're on. Um, Introducing that mindset that education can be a place for you, I think is part of this conversation as well. Luckily, there are institutions that have taken steps toward making education accessible for people who are incarcerated. So some of my alma maters, including Columbia and Northwestern and Cornell, actually, have all, really thought critically about how do we infuse education into carceral facilities. Um, and so, there are programs where, students and educators at universities like the ones I just mentioned actually teach classes in prisons. And in some cases, like Northwestern and Columbia, you can actually get college degrees, while you are, participating in these programs. And so that is a really, really big step for people once they leave the walls of prison and they can say, I have a college degree and I could potentially now enter the workforce and increase my socioeconomic status.
That being said, there's a social aspect to education. How does that potentially harm youth?
Gosh, anytime that you're, in school, there's a lot of pressure to fit in, right? Um, and sometimes kids will shed their true identities and trade them in for identities that they don't really like about themselves, right? They may try to fit in with a group of people. They might try to do things that they might typically not. And just by virtue of what it is, school is a place where these microcosms of trying to fit in exist. And so I think that sometimes, like I said, kids might get in with a wrong crowd because it offers them social protection. It offers them a place to have friends where, could be maladaptive, in some instances. Of course, is this the case always? Definitely not. But, a kid who might feel lonelier, a kid who might be rejected by peers, they might look for more alternative routes to fit in. And again, some of those more alternative options might be maladaptive groups that they might get in.
Another big way children socialize is through their neighborhoods. Why do neighborhoods play such a big role in incarceration?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a conversation that's largely related to, a couple of the topics that we've discussed in terms of like economic opportunity as well as violence. And so again, economic opportunity is huge in terms of neighborhoods, right? So, in some neighborhoods, there's burgeoning businesses and opportunities for people to gain employment and things like that. However, some communities are not invested in by business, and there are fewer economic opportunities for people to engage, in those avenues. And so, there are certain communities that become ignored, and people live there still. So what are they supposed to do, right? Um, so I think there's an economic aspect. Oftentimes with, economically impoverished areas, there could be, instances of violence, for example. So I live in Chicago. The South Side of Chicago is historically, known for gun violence. But again, that is inseparable from, the lack of investment in that community. But I think also community plays a very big role. So like the stuff we just talked about, right, where there might be less opportunity overall and maybe more violence overall, that becomes then a place for police to target, right? Um, Police involvement in those areas is, partially for surveillance, right? However, when you surveil only one area, there's over incarceration in that area, right? And so, despite, equal, maybe rates of law breaking, across two environments, if you are concentrating your police force and surveillance in one of those areas, then you're just going to catch more of that law breaking in that area that you're surveilling heavily, right? And so I think that, this conversation would be remiss without talking about the role of over policing, and over surveillance in some of these communities as well.
Are children from different demographics stopped the same amount by the police?
No. So, Black and Latino youth, are much more likely to be surveilled and, have police interactions. And just, this has many consequences. So number one, if you are over, if you're interacting with the police in a negative way, right? You come to view the police as not protectors of the community, but actually, antagonistic. At the end of the day, this conversation also can relate back to kind of violence against Black and Latino youth as well. So there's some work by, a race scholar and psychologist, Phil Goff, and he finds that, compared to white youth, Black youth are dehumanized, to a greater extent. Um, they're dehumanized to a greater extent, and people also think that Black children appear older than their white counterparts. So, this effect was found among the general population in Goff's research. Um, but, let's just say that pattern applies to how police officers are viewing these youth, as well. Um, well, what's the consequence of that? That could easily, lead to children being treated as adults when they're not, right? And so there could be increased violence, there could be increased brutality, there could be increased just manhandling of a child when they're just that, they're a child, they're not an adult. Of course, these are generalizations. Of course, there are, police officers who might engage in, respectful ways, but overall, I think the data shows that, there is, more negative interactions among Black and Latino youth with police officers compared to, their white counterparts.
Now, is this discrimination always due to blatant racism?
Latent racism, not always. People have implicit biases as well, right? So, an explicit bias would, me explicitly saying out loud, I don't like this person because of, their demographic group, right? Implicit racism and implicit bias in general is it's just more subtle, right? um, you acting in certain ways that could be, maladapt or, unfair based on some preconceived notion you have that maybe is outside of your awareness, right? Um, and even if it's out of your awareness, though, I don't want that to be exculpating for that bias. And what I mean by that is people oftentimes say, oh, it's just implicit bias. Like, I can't help it. That doesn't make it right, right? Like it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it as something that you can't work on. It doesn't mean that you can't educate yourself about these disparities. It can't, and there's research in psychology to show how you can manipulate, or change implicit bias, right? And so it's something that exists, of course, but it's not something that can be changed over time.
What was found by prior work when priming people to think about Black individuals regarding harmless objects?
Yeah, so that was some seminal work done where essentially, there were simulated exercises where they portrayed Black individuals with either harmful or harmless objects. And so a harmful object might be something like a weapon, like a gun, and a harmless object would be something like a cell phone. And so essentially, and this is also, I should say, in the context of law enforcement. And so they were looking at shooting decisions with police officers in, situations where a suspect might have a weapon, something dangerous, or something that was innocuous. And what they found was that when there were situations where, there was a Black man with an innocuous object, there was greater imprecision in shooting decisions in those cases compared to the whites, condition where there was a white man with an, innocuous object. And so, there were more incorrect shootings in that case. And so, what this means is that police officers, have on average more implicit bias against Black people, right? In this case, Black men, viewing them at baseline more dangerous compared to their white counterparts. And they are interpreting this ambiguous motion of, reaching into your pocket and pulling something out as a sign that there might be some danger coming when there's no danger to really exist. Right. And so this is one instance of implicit bias in action where you have some sort of implicit bias and you're acting on it, and it can be a way that can be very harmful, right, in a law enforcement context.
What are Black people who appear more stereotypically Black most vulnerable to?
Well, there's been a lot of work, in the legal context, and one of the most seminal studies in this topic was actually led by, a Columbia professor, Valerie Purdy Greenaway, and this found that people who are Black, who have more stereotypically Black features, right, for what we think of as a stereotypical Black face, they were actually sentenced to longer and harsher legal punishments compared to white people. And then, of course, people who had less stereotypically Black features. And so this study, this wasn't just a study of, vignettes. It was actually, they looked at real, mugshots and things like that. And so it was real data they have looked at out in the real world. It wasn't just a controlled, environment. And so what this shows really is the power of implicit bias in action, right? So even if it's not explicit bias, people can say, "Oh, I don't have racial biases," but you can be thinking about, this is implicit bias that has these real life outcomes, such as sentencing decisions on length of how long somebody is spending incarcerated, and even severe punishments like the death penalty.
Aside from racism, there's also sexism within the legal system. Why do girls get more harshly punished than boys?
Yeah, I think that this is a topic that is extremely overlooked um, in the scholarship, in popular discourse. Um, at the end of the day, when we think about, incarceration, even I said it before, we often think about it as a problem that affects men, right? So, most people who are incarcerated in the US are men. However, what we haven't thought about is the rate of female incarceration over the past decade has skyrocketed. Especially, the rate of incarcerated mothers has really skyrocketed over the past, 5, 10 years. Um, so, why is this happening? I think part of it is a social psychological phenomenon, right? Where we expect as a society girls to act demurely, and we expect girls and women to, you know, act nicely, and if they don't, they are severely punished for it, right? Um, and it's shocking to, I guess, like think about that type of thing in the context of the US, where I think we, as a society, typically view ourselves as a little bit more progressive on gender-related issues compared to, other countries, maybe in Europe or Africa or just other places in the world. But gender disparities very clearly still exist in the United States across all domains of life. And I think incarceration is one of them as well, is that we kind of hold this higher, expectation for women and how they should behave. And when they do break the law, they are especially castigated. Um, I think another just related thing that we can think about, quickly is, maternal incarceration versus paternal incarceration. Because mothers, because child rearing is so tied to mothers in society compared to fathers, there is an especial stigma, I think, at least anecdotally, toward mothers who are incarcerated, that, you're leaving your family, you're not serving your family, you're not helping your family, versus the conversation for men might not be so family focused.
We touched on incarcerated mothers. What's the impact of children not seeing their incarcerated parents much?
Yeah. Well, obviously it's not a good thing, right? There has been some work led by my research team at Columbia about what kids think about their incarcerated parents. And I think that there is a societal notion that it's best to keep parents and children apart, right? When a parent is incarcerated. Sometimes the motivation can be benevolent, that, maybe people think that it's scary for a child to, see their parent incarcerated. And I'm sure it is, right? Like, I'm sure prison is not a nice environment for kids. And especially it can, make kids sad to see their parents incarcerated. It's not a happy environment. But that motivation could be to protect a child. The motivation can also be malevolence in nature, where you just want to really punish the parent, really, even more by withholding their children, right? And so there's been kind of like both motivations stated in popular discourse. But the reality is that what our research shows when we talked to kids of incarcerated parents, that they felt very positively toward their parents, because they viewed them just as that, just their parents. They weren't, you know, this unknown figure. It wasn't this, mysterious person behind bars. It was a person who loved them and a person who cared about them, and they felt the same toward them. And we actually, we recruited a sample of kids whose parents were not incarcerated as well. And we asked them the same sets of questions that we did with kids with incarcerated parents. And what we found was that both kids felt the same. Both groups of kids felt the same about their parents. So, regardless of whether a parent was incarcerated or not, kids felt far more positively than negatively about their parents. And so, having that piece of evidence in our pockets, you know, what do you think that would do, to withhold, parental engagements with their kids? So kids are longing for that relationship, but if they are denied it, then of course it'll, not be good for them. It might breed feelings of abandonment. It might breed feelings of resentment, toward a parent. Because again, a kid really wants that relationship and they feel positively, and so they might not understand why they're being denied that interaction. So um, I think that line of research has been especially critical in these sort of policy related discussions. And it's actually been, introduced to, the House in Kentucky, for example, as a piece of policy related evidence that we should be increasing or at least not restricting, parental engagement with children when the parent is incarcerated.
Transitioning to conditions within prisons, what leads to the dynamic between the guards and the prisoners?
One thing that we've already talked about is racial dynamics. When you look at the demographics of guards and people who are incarcerated, there's on average a pretty stark racial difference. So it's, typically people who are incarcerated are more likely to be Black compared to, other demographic groups. Um, and if you look at the demographics of guards, it's typically white men. So there is sometimes a racial component to all of this. But I think there's just a broader conversation about power hierarchies, right? When people get too power hungry, it's never it's never good, right? Um, there's just this in-group, out-group dynamic that is kind of set up between, guards and, people who are incarcerated. Of course, again, this is generalization. It's not every case. There are, you know, guards in carceral settings who are respectful and they, are upholding the law and stuff like that. But there are instances where there is brutality.
Aside from guard abuse, what's the psychological impact of being locked up without true freedom of will?
There's a lot of research within psychology that shows how people think about their identities. And it turns out that when people think about their own identities, what is core to their identities is actually their relationships with other people. And so if we think about that, so we think about ourselves actually as relational, right? Engaging with other people who we love and care about. Um, that is at the core of who we are. What happens when you take that away? Especially if you think about solitary confinement, which is, of course, separate from incarceration itself, but it's, it's a mechanism that is used to especially isolate people. Um, if you cut off all forms of social connection, it's death of the self. It's death of, a person's relationships with the outside world. And, it might be dramatic to say it, but I think that, cutting off these social ties really results in a person metaphorically dying kind of inside. And so, of course, the conditions themselves inside carceral facilities are not good on average. But the social isolation aspect of it is very difficult, right? For people to deal with. And it can really have lasting trauma on a person. So even if they leave, prison eventually, that isolation can stay with somebody, even if they're back with a community and back with loved ones later on. Um, it can, rewire our brains to never feel happy, with that social engagement even later on. So even if they were longing for it, it might be kind of rejected later on. So it's a very, very sad reality that a lot of people have to experience.
Part of solitary is having the lights on for 23 hours a day, making it nearly impossible to sleep. What impact does this lack of sleep have psychologically?
Well, I'm sure that you've had some late nights, right? Studying for tests and quizzes and all that kind of stuff. And you wake up the next morning and you're not really functional, right? Like you're maybe, you can go through the motions, but you're kind of, your mind is all blurry, you're a little fuzzy when you're trying to think through things. But, that's, you not getting 8 hours of sleep a day. What if you get 0 hours of sleep a day? Um, it's not good, right? Like your circadian rhythm will be all off. Obviously, mental function can be affected. So, I think lack of sleep is associated with anxiety, depression, but then if it gets too bad, it can even, be linked to like things like psychosis, right? And so obviously that's not good for the individual who is being denied lack of sleep. But then think about, okay, so then if they go into a psychotic break, right? Will they be treated nicely or not? Probably not. And so then there is potentially additional punishment tacked on to that behavior when, again, what is needed is helping that individual through a medical condition and not punishments. But oftentimes the response is punishments, which will, of course, not make things better. It will make things worse.
And lastly, if there's one thing that people take away from today's episode, what should it be?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about this topic, it's really easy to become downtrodden, right? Like we're talking about a lot of heavy negative stuff. Um, but I think that there has been more conversation explicitly around this topic over the last, 5 years or so. Um, Not always for good reason, but at least I think it has popped up in popular discourse a little bit more. Um, there have been books around incarceration and disparities around incarceration, pop up a little bit more. The New Jim Crow, for example, is a book that, I think is a really easy lead into talking about incarceration for people, but it has become more in the popular discourse than it has in the past. And so I guess a hopeful note is that people across a broader set of, ideologies and groups have been thinking about this topic more critically. And so I think that awareness maybe has upticked a little bit over time about, incarceration as a pressing societal problem. Um, and there's a lot of groups that are committed to making impacts, in this space. And so as we have seen over the past couple of years, a lot of priorities in terms of legislators and leaders of major cities like New York and Chicago and LA have been bringing issues related to homelessness and poverty and incarceration to the forefront of discussions in those states. And so again, it's not always a welcome discussion, but it's being discussed. And so I think that at least we can have hope for the future, right? That these conversations will be more popularized, will be more comfortable to have for people to be acknowledging these disparities and then, acting on them accordingly. Um, I'll also say that, it's been really encouraging to see across institutions, right, there to be resources invested in programs that are related to, for example, education within carceral facilities. Um, those have not gone away, over time. It wasn't a fad. It was something that these institutions are actually, really investing in. The Center for Justice at Columbia, for example, led by Geraldine Downey, continues to do really excellent work in this space and has been supported for quite a bit of time now, by the university and external partners. And so it's encouraging to see the longevity of some of these programs and for growth in those programs. And so, it's not something that is, all doom and gloom. I think there is a lot of grassroots activity in this space. Um, and so, it's exciting for me, to see, young people like you, thinking about these things very early on in their educational trajectories, to be a potential change maker in this space. So I think that the future is very exciting, particularly to see people, like you come into, the area and potentially do something about it. So keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you got something out of it, even if it's just an interest in mass incarceration. Stay hopeful out there and stay tuned for the next episode.